I kept on thinking after that last episode that I am probably ready to talk more about the story itself. I'm in a place where I think it's almost important to at least describe the story to a certain extent in order to bring context to a lot of things we've been talking about so far.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Thank you for joining me. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is an important step to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all in our healing path and provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. If you or someone close to you has been through the difficult experience of being a victim or survivor, or if your responsibilities involve understanding, supporting, or helping individuals who have experienced the trauma of rape or sexual assault, I urge you to consider subscribing and tuning into this podcast regularly. It's essential to recognize that you are not alone in this journey. There is a community here that cares deeply about your well-being. My goal is to provide you with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. Your experiences matter, and my commitment is to being there for all my listeners every step of the way. Thank you again for joining me. Activation and discretion warning. This episode contains explicit and graphic descriptions of sexual assault and rape. Caution and action is required. This episode is not for children. Please use extreme discretion in listening to this episode, and if you are activated or triggered and need help, call the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Hi, everyone. It's good to have you back with me on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. This is episode 54, and I'm honored to have on one of my regular featured guests and great friend, Alan Manwaring. For those of you who may not know, Alan is the executive director of the Jan Broberg Foundation. He is also a highly regarded consultant, helping groups that are intent on better educating emerging think tanks throughout the world on the importance of understanding the connection between national security strategy policy and economic development. He holds a master's degree in public administration from the Fels Institute of Government at the University of Pennsylvania. Some of you may have listened to Alan's previous episodes, in which case you already know that Alan is also a childhood sexual assault survivor. In our last several episodes, Alan and I have discussed the impacts and dynamics surrounding sexual assault and rape, as well as some of the particular aspects of Alan's personal healing journey. This week is a compelling and powerful episode, as Alan has expressed to me that he feels ready to share some of the details of his childhood sexual assault perpetrated by his 6th grade teacher and several of that teacher's friends and former students. Alan has stated that not only does he feel ready, he also feels that getting his story out is an important and imperative part in not only his own healing journey, but also for others who hear this episode who have a similar experience to his own. This is an amazingly strong and powerful step forward for Alan, and I feel privileged and honored to provide the platform for Alan to tell of his experience. This is not only the beginning of his story, there's more coming next week. But for now, listen to Alan as he shares his strength and courage in beginning his powerful story. Here's Alan. Hey, SAS listeners, welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm very fortunate to have in the studio with me Alan Manwaring, and we're just going to continue in our Alan Manwaring series and pick up where we left off from our last episode together. I'm just going to turn it over to Alan and let him dive right in.
Well, I guess it's been about a couple months, I think, since we had our last conversation.
Yeah.
And I kept on thinking after that last episode that I am probably ready to talk more about the story itself, because I think that'll add context to a lot of things I've been talking about before. You know, another interesting thing you said earlier this evening is we're on a journey, and this is a journey for me. It's a healing journey for me as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been very hesitant to really go into the details of the story before. For some reason, it's hard.
It is hard.
And
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it just is hard. And I guess that I'm in a place where I think it's almost important to at least describe the story to a certain extent in order to bring context to a lot of things we've been talking about so far. Because we talk a lot about bringing the intellectual and the emotional understanding of the fact that it's not your fault together as part of a healing journey process,
Mm-hmm.
how important that is.
Yeah.
We talk about the importance of bringing sex and intimacy together in terms of understanding the togetherness of those things as part of the healing journey. And we've talked a lot about how it doesn't matter how many times people say that it's not your fault, for example, if you don't feel that, that doesn't matter, and how there's a journey and there's a process that you can go through that will help with that understanding. And that part of that process, probably a major part of that process, is telling your story. And one of the things I've experienced definitely in my journey, that being able to tell your story to those you trust and to talk about these things to people you trust is truly part of that healing journey.
Yeah, it's therapeutic.
It's
Even
therapeutic.
if you're not in a therapy session while you're telling that story.
Right.
A huge part of that, as you've alluded to, is who you tell it to, and the
Right.
fact that you have to be able to trust them, and telling it to somebody who is empathic, not even necessarily someone who's been through rape or sexual assault. If they're empathic and trauma informed, I think that's critical. But to have that person actually be a survivor themselves too, I think that really kind of helps make that telling easier.
Yeah. And I think we've talked about this in some of our past conversations,
Right.
is that when you're actually telling your story to someone who has been through the same kind of thing, it doesn't have to be the exact same kind of thing. That's such an important component of telling your story when you're telling it to someone who can understand, I think, about what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And in any case, I think that one of the things that I've felt in the last while, since our first couple of episodes or conversations, is I'm in a place when I listened back on those conversations, I think if there was some context to some of these things, it'd probably make more of an impact on what I'm talking about, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So, and I feel ready to do that. So anyway, that's where I am right now, I guess. And so we'll see where we go. I guess I'm also going to preface this a little bit by saying I think the other part that's important for me, at least, is that grooming is such a process. And that in my case, for example, the grooming was such an intricate part of that process. And understanding that that occurs and understanding how grooming happens, I think is really an important component to understanding that it's not your fault. Because when you're 11 years old, you don't really understand or think about what's going on or why. But when you can look back and see all these things and think, oh my gosh, no wonder that happened, or no wonder I was someone that was identified as being someone who would probably be easy to groom. And I don't really know if that was going through my teacher's mind in terms of why I was one he chose that year. But I think that's important to put into context. And so I'm going to start by going way back. I think it's part of the story. My father did his PhD at the University of Illinois, and I was born when he was doing that. So I was born in Urbana, Illinois. And when I was about 3 years old, he had finished his schoolwork stuff and went on to do a Fulbright scholarship in Brazil. So we went to Brazil for about a year and a half, and lived down in Rio de Janeiro. And when you're, 3, 4 years old and you're living in Rio de Janeiro in the 60s, this would have been, and you're a towhead, you're sort of an attraction. And so everyone's looking at you and they want to touch your hair and they want to tell you how cool you look. And you're sort of used to being out in the midst of all these things and everyone coming up to you saying, "Oh, you're so beautiful." And during that year and a half we were in Brazil, that was sort of the norm. My mom tells the story a lot about when one weekend, the person who was sort of the housekeeper at our place, we were there in Brazil, had said, "Hey, can I take Alan to my house for the weekend to show him to my family?" And my mom's like, "Well,
that's just a little weird."
I know. And so, yeah. And my mom's like,
in context, it makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
You're not ordinary looking.
Right.
You don't fit in.
Right.
But yet, like you just said, in
Yeah.
their eyes, they're like, wow, what a beautiful child.
Yeah.
I've got to show this person off. I
show the
know
person
this
off.
guy.
Exactly. And that's sort of the funny part of that story. She says to the house person, or whatever you want to call him, she goes, "Well, he doesn't speak Portuguese. How is that going to work?" And she said, "He does speak Portuguese. He speaks Portuguese just fine." And I don't think my mom realized that, my sister and I were speaking Portuguese to her and to the kids in the neighborhood easily. And anyway, so my mom says, "Well, okay, fine. Take him to, for the weekend." So that sort of puts things in context as far as what I was used to at a very young age.
Yeah.
And then you fast forward another year. So my dad's first position after finishing his PhD and his Fulbright scholarship kind of stuff. So we moved from Rio de Janeiro and came back to the United States to Wisconsin, which is why I'm a huge Packer fan. Anyway,
Of course.
They make you give
How
a
could
blood
you?
oath after you've lived in Wisconsin for a certain amount of
Right.
time.
Once
That
you
even
get
if you leave, you're a
residency.
Packer fan for the rest of your life,
That's
and I
right.
have kept that oath. So his first position was at a university in Wisconsin. My mom was the dorm mom. Okay, so I was about 5 or 6 by then, or something of that nature. My mom was a dorm mom, so we lived at the dorms. Of course, my sister, who's about a year and a half older than I am, I have a younger brother who was actually born in Wisconsin. And there's these 2 little kids, and then 3, who are like the darlings of all the students who are at the dorms. And this is during the era when Saturday mornings was cartoon morning. And so Saturday mornings, all the students would come down. "Can we take Alan and Susan and take them downstairs and watch cartoons with them," and things of that nature. So I was really doted on constantly by college students.
Right.
By these college students who would constantly want to come in and take care of and be with the kids of the dorm mom and dad, so to speak. And life continues. And so I'm just putting things in context as far as what my experiences had been and what I had been around and what I was used to as far as people sort of doting on these things. Then we moved to Memphis. My father's next position was at what was then called Memphis State University. It's now called the University of Memphis. So we moved to Memphis between my 2nd and 3rd grade year. I was always a pretty good student. And so 3rd grade, I was chosen to be one of the librarians, which all that meant was that when you went to the library, you were one of the guys that was in charge of helping the kids check their books out and keeping track of. But again, it was one of these things where you were chosen as one of the 4 sort of leaders of that class. Then go to 4th grade, same thing. I was pretty tall for my age, I guess. And I was one of those kids who was always chosen to be the one that would pick the teams for kickball. And I was also, not just a good student, I was also a pretty cooperative kid, if you want to call it that or whatever. And so I became a teacher's pet. And I could sort of see that happening. And by 4th grade, I could definitely identify. And I remember thinking to myself, I was sort of always one of the leaders in the class. And that's when I first sort of identified that part of my personality or that part of my existence. And so then that continued into 5th grade. And so I was always sort of one of those teacher's pet, good student, a leader among my peers. And, if you can call yourself leaders among your peers when you're in 4th and 5th grade, but they exist.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah. Between 5th and 6th grade, in my school, they changed the system where you actually had 3 different teachers in 6th grade instead of just one. You had language arts as one, you had social studies as the other, and you had science and math as the other. And so we had 3 different teachers that we would rotate in during the day, unlike previously where it had been one teacher for all the other grades previous to that. And so when I was in 6th grade, it was my math and science teacher who was the culprit in all this kind of stuff. He had been a former priest and then become a 6th grade teacher. We could go on and on about how in heaven's name that would ever happen. This is a public school, but I think the principal of the school was a guy who was Catholic, which is fine. But I know that my fourth grade teacher was a former nun. I think my third grade teacher was a former nun too, now I think about it. I think he must have gotten a lot of people from his experiences and brought them to that school to teach. This is like in the 1970s when they just moved things around. So I don't know the details of why these things happen, but for whatever reason, my sixth grade math and science teacher was a former priest. I remember at the beginning of the school year, he would ask me to do these math puzzles. I was really good in math. He would ask me to do these math puzzles for the whole class. There was another friend of mine named Chris who would help me too. And so we would go into his little office off to the side of the room, and we'd create math puzzles for the class to do. And then he would take what we would create and give them to the class to do math puzzles as part of their math. But eventually, my teacher was sort of like, "Oh, Chris, you don't need to do this. Alan can do this by himself. He's fine doing this by himself." I remember, I was the kind of student, I had never been in a fight in my entire life in school. And I remember when my teacher had sort of said to Chris, you don't need to be in there anymore and let Alan do this by himself kind of thing. I remember Chris being sort of mad about that. And I remember that was the closest I'd ever gotten into being in a fight. And in hindsight, I didn't think about why that was happening. But I remember that closest I ever got to in a fight in my school was when Chris was all mad because he couldn't help me do the math puzzles anymore. My dad was a professor at the university. This was the university school. And so it was right on campus. And so I would easily go after school to go meet my dad. And my sister was a couple years older than I was, 2 grades older. My brother was 4 grades younger. And so oftentimes we just really hang out around for a couple of hours after school and then go meet my dad over at his office or do something, or it just always depended upon the day or the situation. I guess my point of that was it was not unusual for there to be an hour or two after school where I really didn't have anywhere I had to be. So eventually my teacher would say, "Well, you know what? Don't do the math puzzles during school. Just do them after school. Stay after school. You have to go meet your dad for another hour or two, whatever." And not every day. On certain days, I would still have to go meet my dad like sooner. My mom was a high school English teacher. And so she wouldn't get home until, 5 o'clock or whatever. So it was always waiting around, having a couple of hours after school to like do whatever. This is also during a time when kids would go home and they go play with friends. And there was not a lot of helicopter parenting where there was not, a lot of accountability from after school for the next couple of hours, a lot. Certainly not every day, but a lot of the time. And so I would start staying after school and doing the math puzzles and things like that. And I would notice that he would have friends of his come by and visit him after school. His friends would be, I'm assuming that they were former parishioners or former students of his. I'm not really sure how long he had been a 6th grade teacher. I don't think he'd been a 6th grade teacher in our school until that year. And they just drop by, hang out with him, and I'd be there doing my little math puzzles kind of things. And the conversations between my teacher and these other students of these other former students of his, who were probably about anywhere from 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, would evolve eventually into these sort of bizarre special student kind of conversations about what special students were. It would use the Greek models of Greek special students in Greece. All the Greeks would identify special students. And these are the kind of things that special students would do. And it was sort of this evolutionary process where they would talk about what a special student I was. Then he would bring posters of what special students would do in Greek times, and they'd be wrestling naked. The other special student that was there, who was 17 or 18 years old, would talk about, I'm a special student, and I've been a special student of my teachers for a long time. Over time, they would evolve into conversations where the students would say, I remember like one time, the older student, saying, "Hey, you're getting older, and if you notice on these posters of these special students that are, wrestling, that as you get older, your penis is going to get larger." And then I remember once he just pulled his pants down and showed me. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, okay. And he just said, "Hey, this is what it will look like later on as you get older." Then in a conversation that may have occurred a week or two after that, he would show me again and then say, well, let me see what yours looks like to see how you're developing. And then those kinds of things would evolve into them talking about how special students and special teachers would share certain juices, is I think the word they would use. Then they would sort of explain how that worked. I remember at one point, the older student taking his pants off again, showing me how big he was, so to speak, and then doing the things that would make him even larger. And then explaining how I needed to take the juices to help become even a more special student. And while this is all sort of going on, my teacher sort of sit there watching and nodding his head. And so these things were the way that it would evolve. And of course, they'd always say, you don't, that whole Fight Club kind of mentality where special students don't talk about these things. I guess that's probably one of the hardest things to understand about the mentality of how these things happen is why would people sort of go by that? Or why would they think, okay, in that case, I don't think I should talk about it to anybody. I don't know. I still to this day don't understand why our minds would acquiesce to that concept. I'm sure part of that goes back to the whole concept of an 11-year-old mind versus a much older adult mind, and how we don't really quite understand what it was like to be 11, and how we look at these things from that perspective of, being an adult. We start working through these things in our lives, and then we don't really understand completely how our mind would work then. And I think we've even talked about in one of our other conversations, one of the guys in my Salt Lake group, who is just one of the best guys in the world, would always say, Alan, you've got to be able to go back and connect with your 11-year-old self. And I still don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I remember talking about that, and even up to now, I'm thinking, how does that process
Yeah, how
work?
does that work? Well, yeah, and it's interesting because several of these people that I know quite well from my group therapy things have talked about, for them, the importance in their journey of being able to go back to their childhood, or at least put themselves in a position to relate to their 11-year-old self, for example. And I think the way they describe it a lot is, these guys would always say to me, Alan, you got to sit down with your 11-year-old self and put your arm around him and just say, hey, it's okay. And I asked that same question, which is, how do you do that? I don't know the answer. I don't. I don't understand how to do that. And I'm a lot less far on my journey than I think a lot of my peers are that I work with in these men's groups. I think I have not gotten quite down the road as far as a lot of these other guys have.
And I guess I can relate to that too. So maybe it is a maturity process of the healing journey.
Right.
I don't know.
I don't know either. I totally understand that. But I think maybe that's it, because there's a lot of guys who I would also consider for my groups who are also very far along on their journeys in their healing processes, who they also don't relate to the concept of going back to do that with your 11-year-old self, for example, and really sit down and think about that. But I guess back to the point I was talking about, is like I find it really hard now to sort of figure out why at 11 I would acquiesce to the concept of, okay, I'm not going to talk to anyone else about this. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to tell anybody else. And I was never threatened. No one ever said to me, if you tell anybody, I'm going to kill your parents or kill your brother or your sister. No one ever said that to me.
Which does happen to some victims, and survivors
absolutely
have that memory.
Absolutely. It does.
But if I could interject
Sure.
another thing too, is that in that process of acquiescing, I can certainly remember feeling a sense of wanting to fit in.
Right. Okay, yes. And I think that's a huge component of the way I was as a child, probably the way I'm still today. I mean, I think that thinking back on these experiences as a kid, and when I was talking at the beginning about how I was sort of always doted on when we were in Rio de Janeiro, and then when I was in the dorms with the college students when I was like 4 and 5 and 6 years old, whatever. I mean, I know that for me, I'm sure, whether it was from having been doted on and having those experiences from such a young age, or whether it was just inherently part of my nature, I don't really know, but I'm sure that part of me always needed the attention, wanted the attention. Maybe I came to a place in my life where I expected the attention and therefore wanted the attention, and then would be drawn to the attention.
I think I can totally relate to that in the sense of what you were talking about in terms of in the nature versus nurture aspect of growing up. The nurture part of you had been receiving these accolades and these
Right.
kinds of uplifting kind of comments and, oh, he's beautiful. And I don't call that grooming in the sense that people use the word grooming.
Right.
Because there's some malintent
Mm-hmm.
in the sexual assault, rape, grooming aspect. So I don't look at what was going on with you as being a negative thing in terms of being told you're beautiful and being shown off to your parents, employees, family by taking you home for the weekend.
I know.
And the college students doting on you, as you use the word doting, in terms of just kind of feeling maybe the process of come watch cartoons with us. It's a reverting back to their childhood by communing with you in your childhood kind of thing. So I don't look at those as negative experiences, but certainly influential to the point where when you are starting to be groomed, it felt very similar in nature, especially the terminology you used, being called a special student. Was that the terminology they consistently used?
Special student was the terminology.
And you had always been thought of as special from the time you remember at 3 and 4 years old. That, this feels normal, this feels right, this feels, although you probably didn't have those cognitive thought processes, the subconscious was, I'm right where I should be in this scenario. I am a special student. Whether you thought that or not, it was nature by then because of the nurture.
Right. And you're absolutely right. I don't look at my experiences when I was 3 and 4 years old in Rio de Janeiro, or my experiences in the dorms in Wisconsin, for example. I don't look at those as part of a grooming process. That was just part of my development that made it so when I became groomed by my teacher, it didn't feel any different than what I had experienced previously.
And so then, Alan, to be told special students don't talk about these things, if you're already feeling like you're where you belong and you're feeling like this is part of that special student mantle that you were already carrying as somebody that was somewhat elevated with your peers, now you're kind of like, as a 5th grader, you said?
6th grader.
6th grader, being admired by adults or near adults. And that has to then also have this feeling of acceptance at an even higher level.
Right. And I think that's, absolutely. And so when I look back and think through all these things, I sort of feel like I recognize that concept of like, I wanted to be recognized by these adults. And I had already previously been recognized by adults in the dorm rooms, for example, when, as a child, and that wasn't that much earlier than 6th grade. It was like only in 2nd and 1st grade.
Yeah.
And so I was very used to that.
And I was just going to say, it wasn't a shock to the system.
No, and I think this is the other part that leads into this is as the special student concept would continue to develop, as the experiences with these 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, whatever guys would continue to develop, we could fast forward and a lot of the real difficult abuse kind of things would occur in the dorm rooms of these other guys, these other older special students. So the conversations would occur in my teacher's office off the side of the classroom after school, would eventually lead to me going to their dorm rooms. And that was when the much more intense abuse would occur. Again, the concept of special students and the concept of taking juices that would make you better would continue. And there was a situation where our class was going to go on a field trip, and we were going to go overnight out into the countryside and learn about nature and all that kind of stuff. And again, this was not an uncommon situation. I mean, in fourth grade, our fourth grade teacher had taken us all to St. Louis for 3 days. We went to a St. Louis Cardinal baseball game. That was really cool when you're in fourth grade.
Yeah.
We had gone to, what they called Grant's Farm.
Yeah, I remember Grant's Farm.
Yeah, so in my school at that time, going on an overnight kind of thing was, that was normal. So in sixth grade, at one point in time, we went on this overnight trip, just not very far outside of the city, and stayed in these tents. And our whole point, I guess, of that was to learn about nature and to learn about trees and environment. And it was one of these situations where my teacher was in charge of that particular trip, and he had recruited some of his former students, parishioners, whatever they were, to help him in that trip. And, you get there and you are assigned to your tent and things like that. And I was assigned to be with one of those special students instead of with another student. And of course, our tent was a little further away down toward the creek. And it was that particular situation where I was introduced to the concept of getting juices a different way. And I was really confused and not very happy about the situation. I remember a lot of things, but the next morning, I remember I was really upset and I felt sick. And I told my teacher, I said, I'm sick. I feel sick. I want to go home. I just want to go home. I just want to go home. And I think he realized probably what had occurred that night. And I think he was actually sort of upset with that person. Anyway, so I kept on saying, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. And so they took me home, that morning. So I remember, calling my dad and saying, I'm sick. I'm at the trip with the school, but I got to come home. And so someone took me home and dropped me back at the house earlier that day. And I remember for about 2 or 3 weeks after that, I would make sure I didn't have to stay after school. And then within 4 or 5 weeks after that, things would continue and develop. And then again, I think going back to the context of some things from earlier, I really don't know if, again, it was part of that need to be accepted or that need to be paid attention to by these adults. I don't really know. But then within 3 or 4 weeks after that particular situation, I was back doing my puzzles, and those guys were coming in and talking, and they would, hey, come over to my dorm room. And then we would go over there, and those things would continue that were the most extreme part of being abused. When I think back of some of these things, I know that part of me didn't want to get in trouble from the teacher. And I didn't want to be at school and being in trouble. I remember feeling if I didn't go along with a lot of this kind of stuff that I would be in trouble. And one of my points of reference of this is I remember really well once when he asked me to go to a basketball game. He goes, I got tickets to the Memphis State basketball game on Friday night or whatever night it was. And my dad and I had tickets to those games. We'd shared season tickets with another one of the professors at the university, and we'd had half of the season tickets. And so I'd go to the games with my dad, and my dad would take my younger brother, and I was very used to going to the basketball games and had a really good time. And that was during a time when they were really a good team too. Went to a national championship game against UCLA. And anyway, I remember very distinctly, my teacher had said, "Hey, I got extra tickets to the basketball game. You ought to come with me tomorrow or the next night or whenever, 3 nights. Or I don't even know how long it was." And I'm like, I don't really want to go. And I remember the day after that game, he came to me with the one ticket and said, "Hey, this was your ticket, and you didn't go to the game with me." I could feel his scorn. And so when I think back on a lot of this and try and put some of these dots together and pieces together and things of that nature, I'm sure that part of me didn't want to go to school with my teacher being mad at me. And I guess at some point in my process of all this, I must have come to a conclusion that if I didn't go along with these things, that I'd be going to school with my teacher being mad at me. And I just didn't want to do that. And again, that's something I think about in hindsight. I have no idea if that really is what was going on in my mind or not. But you probably have a better idea because you know these things much better than I do.
I think a lot of what you're inferring and what you're talking about and your confusion as to, I don't know, now as I look back on this, how much of it is just me kind of analytically thinking. But I think there was probably a lot of subconscious thought process going on. There was some feeling, emotions that accompany words that are said to us, and scorn, for instance, you brought up.
Yeah.
That also are fed by the previous things that we were talking about, those experiences that you had that nurtured you to the point of not wanting to make your teacher angry, not wanting to go to school with a teacher that's angry with you, more of a sense of emotional impact than cognitive thought processes.
Well, yeah, and when you're saying that, that also brought to my mind how in my therapy with these guys in Salt Lake who I just adore, when I first started that 7-8 years ago, whenever that was now, during those first couple of years, I remember Terry particularly, who's sort of the wisest of them all. Well, I shouldn't say that because they're all very, very wise. But Terry just has this way of like just being able to see right through people. And he'd always say to me, "Alan, you've got to stop analyzing everything and start feeling. Express how you feel instead of trying to analyze everything."
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that.
I think there is too. And one of the greatest compliments I ever received from this process was not that long ago. And I had talked about something during our group, and Terry looked at me at the end of that and said, "Alan, do you realize that you have just talked about how you felt about something instead of analyzing something?" And I'm like, yay, I'm getting better.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so true.
And yeah, and so in this conversation, as I'm thinking back on these things, it was like I didn't want to feel scorn. I didn't want to feel my teacher being upset with me.
Right.
And that makes sense.
It makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense,
And
especially I think at that age when so much of our relationship to life, because we're young and not cognitively developed and don't understand really how things work, we rely on feelings, I think,
Yeah.
a lot more than maybe we do as adults, where we're
Yeah.
trying to analyze and trying to
Yeah.
configure and trying to technically, logistically place ourselves where we need to be instead of being sensitive to our feelings.
yeah.
It's easier when you're young,
Yeah.
because that's how childhood works.
Yeah.
You react emotionally much more than cognitively.
Yeah. I want to back up a tiny bit here in terms of context again. Part of, I think, the reason I wanted to express some of those background things, which was not part of the grooming process itself, but part of my background, was going to dorm rooms as a kid with students in college was something I was very familiar with. We lived in the dorms. You know how, like,
Right.
in a lot of those dorm halls, the dorm mom has, back in those days, the dorm mom, there was an apartment, and that's where the family lived, and we lived there. And so, like I was saying, it wasn't just cartoons on Saturday morning. It was like we had 400 babysitters sitting there. I'd go to dorm rooms all the time. And so, again, in thinking things through, going to the dorm rooms with these guys was not an unfamiliar thing. But what I was about to say a second ago, too, which you just brought to my mind, and I probably have told you this before in maybe our conversations in general. I'm not sure if I can't remember if I've said this in one of our conversations on the podcast, but one of the things I really remember so distinctly, as far as, how when you think back of really traumatic incidences from those experiences, obviously I can think back of some of these experiences that were horrendous as far as the real bad stuff. But one of the things that haunts me from all these experiences, almost more than some of those other things, which I find interesting, is one of the things that my teacher would do is he would, when I was in his little office doing those math puzzle kind of things, he would put his chair next to my chair, and he would put his fingers on my face and my cheek. And he'd get right up to my face, and he'd look at me, and he would just say, "Ellen, you are so beautiful. You are so beautiful. Your blue eyes are so beautiful." And his hands would be right there. And I remember feeling so uncomfortable. That's one of the experiences that I think back on with the most uncomfortableness. Anyway, I find that to be interesting too, as far as just things that I think back on, or feelings that I have on feeling repulsion. And anyway.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This has been a potent and influential episode from Alan Manwaring, and I can't thank him enough for his courage and strength in sharing this first part of his horrific yet extremely insightful experience of manipulation and grooming that we can all avail to learn and grow in our own healing journey. Please take a minute to rate this episode and to write a note to Alan to tell him how this episode has impacted you and helped you on your healing path. Also, don't forget to tune in next week to hear Alan's equally powerful follow-up to this episode. You won't want to miss it. Let's all do our part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Subscribing and listening to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories is one way, and another equally important way is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.